I'm a professor, so one of the nicest things about that is that students that I haven't seen or heard of for years may suddenly be in touch. It's wonderful. It's a great part of the job. And you have to understand that former students are like teenagers, okay? So when they get in touch many years later, they usually want something. Torsten, you said this or that, many moons ago, and I don't quite remember what it was, but it was kind of memorable, and can you help me? Can you remind me what you said? If I had a list of the things asked for most often by former students, at the top of it, I think, would be this. Theology meets sausage. Sausage meet theology. All right, one more thing before we dig in. Imagine that we're going back to the time when there was this TV series, Quincy's. Quincy was a coroner, okay? Quincy was the dude who would look at corpses and determine what was the cause of death and ultimately, who's responsible for it. But Quincy was also a professor, an adjunct professor, I guess, at medical school. So what Quincy did was he would show medical students on their first day corpses, and they are in bad shape. Maybe they were already opened up, or they were in bad shape because of crime or accident or whatever. Now, you might ask yourself, why would a coroner be asked to teach medical students, especially on the first day? Well, a couple of answers, but one of them is, in order to help the living who get sick, you have to understand the dead. So every episode of Quincy starts with a scene where he sort of pulls back the sheet and there's his corpse, and the medical students that are standing around in a semicircle, half of them are falling over. So I thought I needed a prop in case the content wasn't engaging enough. Here it is. This is from Grundhofer's Butchers, this sausage, and they're great store. And no, I didn't get the sausage for free for saying that. So when I introduced sausage to theology, I chose this to represent theology. And this book is called Grasping God's Word, a hands-on approach to reading, interpreting, and applying the Bible. It perfectly embodies what happens in theological education when it comes to making the connection between text or from text to people sitting in the pew. If you are interested in seeing what is often taught in seminaries in terms of making that move from text to people in the pew, I'm finding that this kind of approach is actually fairly prevalent across the board. So what I put before the minds of the students was this image with a sausage machine. The basic idea is you insert a pig and out come sausages. You picture some kind of conveyor belt maybe with workstations, and you start here and then it goes there and somebody does this and there somebody does something else and whatnot. In theology, that is kind of how students who future pastors are trained to teach the text of the Bible. I wrote about this stuff, so I actually did some research around this, but I don't want to get into that now. I'm basically just telling you, I think I know a little bit about it. The first time I thought about a sausage machine was when a number of students actually on different occasions came to me. They had just come from homiletics class, the first homiletics class, and they said, our professor, who's also a pastor somewhere, told us we should forget what we learned in hermeneutics because this was the really important business, because this is where you're really doing something for the congregation. A number of things about that irked me. I mean, one of them was, of course, it seemed to be rather arrogant, one colleague to say to the students, ignore classes by other colleagues because this is the most important one, especially when those professors often aren't actually academically qualified to teach at that level. So when somebody comes in and then treats the actual craft of how humans function and how they interpret and how they could and should interpret reasonably, and they kind of pour cold water over that kind of irks you a little bit. But more than that, it's the fact that somehow homiletics, the art of preaching and how you end up with a sermon, that somehow that art trumps all the other stuff. The actual craft of doing the hard interpretive work. I mean, we're interpreting the Bible, which is 2,000 years old, and to be told that, hey, whatever effort you put into doing that well, put that on the back burner because we're just going to give you this shortcut here, and that shortcut I call the sausage machine. All right, so what is a sausage machine in theology look like? You start with a translation, and here's a positive marker for you, by the way. If you, as a non-expert, are wondering whether something is contested or not in a particular Bible translation that you're using, and every translation has good sides and bad sides to it. None are perfect. Some are awful, but none are perfect. If you want to find out whether something is contested and you need to do a little more investigation to see what the deal is, use maybe 2 or 3 really different translations, compare them on the internet. That's super easy. You go to something like, I don't know, BibleGateway.org or something. Go there and compare them, and where you find significant differences in translation, then you obviously have an indication that there's an issue here. Now, don't trust the comments that people make at that point in study Bibles and whatnot, where they persuade you that this is the way it needs to be translated. Why not? Because Bible translations are commissioned by publishers. Publishers are usually driven by theological agendas. Does any of this surprise you, by the way? I hope not. Their agendas, ultimately, their theological agendas, ultimately are also informed by, obviously, profit margin. I mean, yes, they need to live, and if you look at Christians and Christian leaders and how they live and the kind of money they make and so on, at least some of them, then it's no different, no different from society at large. So there's significant money involved, there's a profit motif, but there are also lots of people who are not doing it for that and who are actually doing it for not very much money. So there's a whole spectrum. I'm just saying to you, when you pick a Bible translation because somebody recommends it, you need to have your critical awareness in place, some sort of filter. And one way of doing that is by looking at a number of different translations, just to be alerted as a first step as to where are the fault lines here. Usually no translation is good enough for everything. So if somebody insists on just one translation, I have my questions about that. In the sausage machine, the first workstation is essentially to find the actual text as close to the original biblical text as we can. That's called text criticism. The next station is the one where you translate it into whatever language is useful to you, and then there are plenty of other stations right after that. So far in those first 2 steps, figuring out the most likely text from a sea of ancient manuscripts, hardly any of which are complete. And again, you really need experts to do that for you. It's amazing work, and I have nothing but admiration for people who are able to do that. After that, when you translate it linguistically into your language, at this point, it's still about the text. That is fantastic news. Every other station in this complex sausage machine is going to take you away from the text. That is my contention, and I'm going to demonstrate it to you. Now, if you wanted to look at this in more detail, then a short video is not going to do that for you. Over at Warehouse Theology, we do that. We go into detail because we're conceiving of Warehouse Theology as an alternative to theological education. But anyway, my point right now is the first 2 workstations in the machine are basically about the text, which is great because as Christians, we say to people that the biblical text is really important to us. We think that God speaks to us through it, and consequently, we want to take it seriously. But in light of that, it's a little bit troubling that every other part of that horseshoe sausage machine workstation setup takes you incrementally away from the text. Excuse me. And if I had one main criticism, I have many in detail, and there's also some good stuff in here. But the main criticism that I have of something like this, every step of the way, you actually end up moving away from the text that everybody claims is so important to us. How can that be? I want to demonstrate to you what I'm saying. So let's look at the 3rd station. So the first was recovering the text, the most likely text with all the different manuscripts that we have, very technical. The second one was translating it. So there's amazing work being done here. It's fabulous. But then the next one is where it starts to go wrong. And guess what? That is where hermeneutics is supposed to kick in even more than in the first two stations. And it usually doesn't. Basically, because of the kind of attitude that I referenced earlier. When a homiletics professor walks into the classroom and says, don't take that hermeneutics stuff too seriously because this is where the rubber really hits the road. How does hermeneutics that should kick in at that point get so displaced like I just mentioned? It gets displaced by something that is called principlizing. Principlizing. It sounds a little arid and dry initially, but once you get the idea that, you take a text that seems a little foreign at times and you turn it into a principle that you can relate to, bingo, we're in good shape. But I think it is deeply, deeply problematic. You start with a text, you end up with a principle, all right? Consider that for a second. You start with a living text, and your goal is to turn it into a dead principle, which you then breathe new life into. Eventually, that's a much later station on the horseshoe, the sausage machine. Later, you breathe new life into that, but it's different life. It's your life, and that's where it gets, in some ways, even worse, because what ultimately comes out at the end doesn't really have much to do with the text at all anymore. What really happens is that whoever engages in this procedure that seminaries up and down the country teach their students who are becoming pastors, what actually happens at the end is that the pastor, the single person in a church, determines what the congregation at large needs to hear. And the biblical text is actually left behind. There's this awful Christian writing called, Left Behind, the Left Behind series, Tim LaHaye. Just so damaging on so many fronts. But this is the real Left Behind story. To my mind, the actual Left Behind story is the one where the biblical text is something that you use to get started, and then progressively you move away from it and you end up with something that you hand over or you sort of offer to your congregation in the end. And the congregation thinks that this is Bible, what they're getting there. What they're really getting is something that may be good or not so good or whatever, but it's certainly not Bible anymore because, you may have had an animal at the front end and now you have a sausage at the back end. The sausage may be great or not so great. This is andouille. I think you call it that when nobody knows what's in it or something. I don't know. But my point is, you are going to end up with something that, good or not so good, has very little to do with the Bible. You would have a very hard time as a theologian to take that and then to get in a time machine, go back into biblical times and say, hey, look at this, look how we used what you guys wrote and made it relevant today. And people would go, what? What's happening here? We are not going to look at the whole sausage machine in one video, so I'm going to wrap it up now. But I wanted you to know that as much as we're off to a good start in terms of the sausage machine, the wheels come off quickly, basically after the second workstation. That's a big problem. What I will do in the next few videos is to put positive alternatives alongside each of these procedures to basically say, this is what we're doing, but maybe this is what we could be doing or this is what we should be doing, so that at the end we end up not having estranged ourselves from the biblical text while still claiming biblical authority, but we're actually doing something that in a sense honors the thing that we're claiming to be interpreting.
Sometimes when I think about this stuff, I wonder, why do people who principlize, and especially people who write about it and who espouse this kind of approach, why do they bother with the Bible at all? I mean, if you're going to reduce the Bible to principles, you really don't need the Bible ultimately. I mean, just sell people your principles. If you take, for instance, the Book of Nehemia in the Old Testament, and you reduce it to something like some Bible study about leadership principles, you have slaughtered that book. Why would you even do that? You don't need that. If you want to sell people leadership principles, go ahead and do it. Why use the Bible? That's the piece I don't get. I can only imagine two scenarios. Either people who do that, who are into principlizing, either they think that they're actually interpreting the text, which they are not, or they know they're not, but they're using the Bible because it adds that authority to what they're saying. I don't know which is worse.